Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you're looking for a shortcut to understanding the incredible forces that shape North America, you have come to the right place.
That's right.
Today we're jumping into a geopolitical story that honestly almost defies belief. We're talking about the history of the French Wars in America.
It's a fantastic topic.
We've got a great set of sources here that take us through colonial rivalry, total war, and then a revolutionary alliance that completely changed the world.
It really is an extraordinary historical contradiction when you lay it all out. We're going to be tracking how France goes from being Great Britain's, main colonial competitor.
The one they were trying to crush.
The one they spent decades and fortunes trying to crush, exactly. And then they become America's most essential, you could even say indispensable, ally against that same British crown.
And this shift, it wasn't some overnight thing. We're really looking at a long, continuous struggle, right? It spans the late 17th century all the way through the 18th.
A long time. And it's fundamentally a battle between France and Great Britain for control of North America.
Understanding that rivalry, it feels like that's the key to understanding how the United States was even born.
It is. These wars weren't just about, drawing lines on a map. They were about defining the entire economic and cultural future of the continent.
So our mission today is to show you that deep historical context, the story behind that final game-changing partnership.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this journey. We'll start before the really big wars and look at how this rivalry even got started. So before the massive conflict that everyone knows about, there were these decades of smaller, grinding colonial skirmishes. Historians call them wars for empire. But what was actually driving them? It wasn't just about flags and glory, right?
Oh, not at all. It was all driven by economics, specifically the quest for control over valuable inland resources.
Like the fur trade.
Primarily the fur trade. I mean, you have to think of beaver pelts as the oil of the 17th and 18th centuries. It was the currency.
Right.
So the French presence was largely focused on setting up trading posts, these little forts, along all the key rivers and lakes, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi, the St. Lawrence.
They wanted to control the highways of the trade, basically.
Exactly. They wanted to control the flow.
Okay, so if the French strategy is built around trade and controlling these interior waterways, how did the British approach differ?
It was a completely different model. The British, especially in their coastal colonies, were all about permanent agricultural settlement. Land acquisition. And this created, fundamentally incompatible colonial systems. The French needed partners in trade.
And the British needed territory for farms.
And that brings us to maybe the most crucial element of this whole early phase.
The alliances with indigenous peoples.
The absolute necessity of those alliances. If you're the French, you're there to trade. If you're the British, you're there to settle. Think about how that affects your diplomatic strategy.
What's a completely different sales pitch?
A completely different pitch. And this is where the story gets really nuanced, because the French had, relatively smaller colonial populations.
Right, they weren't sending massive waves of settlers.
No. They prioritized that trade flow, so they often built these deeper, more integrated alliances with certain tribes, like the Huron or the Abenaki. They needed these relationships for everything, for survival, for mapping, for access.
So their forts were kind of vulnerable without that support.
Very vulnerable. They were often thinly manned and relied heavily on their native allies for security, for logistics, for everything.
But the British, with their constant need for more land, they must have had a much tougher time building trust. Yet they still needed allies to win.
They did. And they often found success with the powerful Iroquois League. They could leverage existing rivalries between tribes, and frankly, they often had better manufactured goods to offer in trade.
Ah, okay.
But that relationship was always, let's say, more transactional. It was inherently strained because of that relentless push for land.
So neither side really had a stable situation.
Not at all. Success in any of those earlier wars, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, it depended entirely on how effective these shifting native alliances were. The whole thing was this incredibly complex web of indigenous geopolitics, with the Europeans almost as secondary partners.
That really sets the stage perfectly, because by the mid-1700s, that competition for the interior just reaches a boiling point. And here is where it all goes global. The conflict that decides the fate of the continent. what we call the French and Indian War, running from 1754 to 1763.
And we have to remember, this was just the North American front of a much larger global conflict.
The 7 Years' War.
Exactly. This wasn't some local spat. It was a world war. And the spark that lit the whole thing on fire was remarkably specific.
The Ohio Valley.
The Ohio Valley. Both empires saw that fertile region as the absolute gateway to the rest of the continent.
And the person who basically delivered the match to that spark was a very young and very ambitious colonial militia officer.
Yes. We often gloss over just how dramatic the start was. In 1754, a young George Washington is sent by the governor of Virginia into the Ohio Valley to, challenge French expansion.
And it doesn't go well.
It does not go well. He's very quickly defeated at a place called Fort Necessity, his surrender. That was the critical point of escalation.
It wasn't just a small defeat.
No, this was seen as a major insult to the British crown. It demanded a full imperial response, and it turned a regional border dispute into a full-blown intercontinental war.
It's just amazing that the future leader of the American Revolution is the man whose defeat arguably started the World War that will eventually bankrupt his future enemy, Britain.
It is the ultimate historical irony. It's incredible.
So who are the main players on the ground?
You have the French forces, allied with numerous Native American tribes, fighting against the much larger British colonial forces, who were backed by the full power of the British Army and their own native allies.
And the fighting was focused on these key strategic points.
Yes, exactly. Think of these intense, brutal battles for control of places like Fort Duquesne,
which was right where Pittsburgh is today.
at the confluence of 3 major rivers. If you controlled that fort, you controlled the Ohio River and the gateway to the west.
So after years of this really grueling conflict, Britain finally wins. A crushing total victory in 1763.
A comprehensive victory.
The scale of the territorial fallout is it's hard to wrap your head around what actually happened to the map.
It's a radical redrawing of North America. It permanently removes France as a major player on the continent.
Okay, so what did they give up?
Under the Treaty of Paris, France ceded virtually all of its territory.
All of it.
All of it east of the Mississippi River, directly to Great Britain. That includes all of Canada, the Great Lakes region, everything. French power in the east was just erased.
Gone. Okay, but what about west of the Mississippi? The huge Louisiana territory. What happened to that?
And that's the other critical piece. Spain had been an ally of Britain's, and as part of this global horse trading, Spain received French Louisiana west of the Mississippi.
So France lost everything. They literally gave it all away to their rivals.
They were utterly decimated in North America. Gone.
So we have an absolute victory for Great Britain. They achieved continental dominance. But total war always has a cost.
A massive cost. And that cost immediately sets the stage for the next conflict.
The debt.
Exactly. The victory of 1763 was catastrophic for Britain's finances. The 7 Years' War nearly doubled Britain's national debt.
Doubled it.
To an astronomical figure, something like 130 million pounds, this debt is the single most critical consequence of the whole war.
And how did Britain decide to pay down a debt that enormous?
By taxing the people who they felt benefited the most from kicking the French out.
The American colonists.
The American colonists. They start enforcing new taxes, new regulations, the Stamp Act, all the things we know from history class. But the colonists, who suddenly don't need British protection from the French anymore, they deeply resent these new taxes.
They felt they had already paid their share in the war.
They did. And that victory, that British victory, directly sowed the seeds of the American Revolution.
This really is the ultimate pivot point in the story. Less than 20 years after being completely erased from the map of North America, France flips the script.
And becomes America's secret weapon.
Right. And we all know the simple reason is revenge, but it has to be more complicated than that. France was struggling financially too. Why take such a huge, expensive gamble on the American colonists?
You have to look at it through the eyes of the French foreign minister at the time, a man named the Comte de Vergennes. For him, this wasn't just, emotional payback.
This was strategy.
This was cold, calculated, realpolitik. France had been humiliated. They desperately needed to restore their prestige and, more importantly, weaken their number one rival, Great Britain.
So this was a strategic investment, not some kind of moral crusade for liberty.
Precisely. Vergennes knew that fighting Britain head-on in Europe again would be way too expensive, way too risky.
But funding a rebellion.
But secretly funding and equipping a colonial rebellion. From his perspective, that was a low-cost, high-reward strategy.
At least at first.
At least at first. So France starts sending covert aid gunpowder, supplies, money long before they ever made the alliance official in 1778.
And the turning point, the moment they decide to go all in, was the American victory at Saratoga.
That was the proof of concept. Saratoga in late 1777 proved to the French that the colonists could actually win. That victory gave Vergennes the justification he needed to sell a full military alliance to the king.
And once that alliance was formalized, the French help became decisive.
Absolutely decisive. We're not just talking about a few supplies anymore. We're talking crucial military support, professional soldiers, huge sums of money, and maybe most important of all,
The French Navy.
the French Navy.
Now, we always hear the name Marquis de Lafayette. He's sort of the face of the alliance. But how important were these key French figures, really?
Lafayette's role was catalytic, no doubt about it. He brought enthusiasm, military skill, and he was this crucial symbolic bridge between the French court and, George Washington's army.
But strategically?
Strategically, you have to highlight the commanders. The Comte de Rochambeau, who led the French ground forces, and Admiral de Grasse, who commanded the fleet. Their contributions were irreplaceable.
Especially at the very end.
Especially at the very end. The pivotal moment that wins the whole war is the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. And it's a perfect example of this alliance in action.
Lay it out for us.
Okay, so you have Rochambeau's thousands of professional French soldiers marching down to Virginia to join Washington's army. Together, they trapped the British General Cornwallis on land.
But he could have been rescued by the sea.
He could have been. But, crucially, the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed up and took control of the Chesapeake Bay. They blocked the British Navy from being able to rescue or resupply Cornwallis.
So without that French naval blockade, the war could have dragged on for who knows how long.
Indefinitely. Yorktown was this perfectly executed combined operation. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the colonial rebellion could only succeed with the full military weight of a European power behind it.
The very nation that was Britain's biggest rival just 20 years earlier became the main reason for Britain's defeat.
And the birth of the United States.
Okay, so let's bring this whole incredible arc together for you. The history of the French wars in America is really a story of continuous European conflict that ends up defining the entire map of North America.
It is. We started with those early colonial skirmishes, the wars for empire, which were all about the economics of the fur trade, and these really complex indigenous alliances.
Which all culminated in the French and Indian War, leading to total British dominance and catastrophic British debt.
And that debt, ironically, is what triggers the American independence movement.
Which France then enthusiastically supports as a way to get strategic revenge, providing that absolute vital support during the U.S. War of Independence.
What's so fascinating is the lasting impact. These conflicts didn't just change borders. They fundamentally shaped the world through the massive financial burdens they created.
It's a domino effect.
It's a perfect domino effect. The debt Britain got from crushing France was the direct cause of the American Revolution. Then, the debt France got from supporting that revolution led directly to their own French Revolution just a few years later.
It's just an incredible cascade of debt crises, all started by a fight over North American land. The United States, as we know it, really owes its existence to the revenge plan of its former colonial rival.
Which brings up a really powerful question, something for you to think about after this. Given those sweeping territorial losses France suffered in 1763, giving up everything east of the Mississippi to Britain and Louisiana west of it to Spain, what was the true historical price the French paid for helping the Americans win their independence just 2 decades later?
That's a great question. They achieved their goal, right? They humiliated Britain on the world stage. But they did it by pouring blood and treasure into a continent where they had already given up all of their claims.
Exactly.
So did the French win the final battle of the Revolutionary War only to sort of solidify their own permanent absence from North America?
A fascinating irony of history to chew on.
Thank you for diving deep with us today. We really encourage you to keep exploring the complex motivations and the monumental risks behind these conflicts that truly defined a continent. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we have a pretty big mission. We're taking a stack of sources on French military efforts in North America, and we're going to try and map out this whole century of conflict, this geopolitical tug of war that completely rewrote the map.
It's so crucial to do because I think a lot of people just hear French and Indian War and think it's one single event.
Exactly.
But when you actually look at the timeline, we're talking about, 4 distinct wars. It spans nearly 100 years, from 1689 all the way to 1783.
A whole century.
Yeah, this was a generations-long struggle for dominance.
Right. So our mission isn't just about reciting dates. It's really to get at the cause and effect. How did these military campaigns lead to massive chunks of territory changing hands? We want to find the why behind those shifting borders.
And this deep dive really shows how a series of seemingly inconclusive wars just kept building momentum. It set up this inevitable collision course.
With the same things again and again, right?
Over and over. Fur trade, control of rivers like the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi, and of course the loyalty of indigenous alliances. They fought until one side just, finally broke.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the very beginning. The first 3 major rounds, these are often, like you said, all lumped together, but they're so important for setting the stage.
They absolutely are. And you have to remember, these weren't just colonial squabbles.
No.
They were direct extensions of these huge dynastic wars happening back in Europe.
Okay, so walk us through that first round.
The timeline kicks off with King William's War. It runs from 1689 to 1697. And in North America, the fighting was brutal. Mostly frontier skirmishes between New France and the English colonies.
New England, New York.
Yeah.
That whole area.
Exactly. It was all about control of Acadia, that's modern-day Nova Scotia, and trying to win over the Iroquois Confederacy, who were, this major power broker in the region.
So after all that fighting, what was the result? Did it actually settle anything?
Not really, and that's the key point.
Yeah.
The war ends with the Treaty of Ryswick. And it achieved almost nothing on the ground in North America. All the territories were just handed back, returned to how they were before the war.
So it's just a bloody, expensive way to maintain the status quo.
Precisely, which of course just guaranteed they'd be fighting again very soon.
Which brings us right to the next one. Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. How did this one differ from the first?
Well, the scope got a lot bigger. It wasn't just the northern frontier anymore.
Right.
Suddenly you have fighting down in the southern colonies, especially around Florida, where the French were allied with the Spanish. You had these raids going deep into New England. It was a much wider conflict.
But this one did have a more decisive outcome in one area, didn't it?
It did. The big one was Acadia. When the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war in 1713, the British got permanent control of Acadia. They renamed it Nova Scotia, and also took over Newfoundland and the Hudson Bay Territory.
So this was the first major permanent loss of land for France.
It was a huge symbolic blow. You can start to see the French getting boxed in.
Okay, so France loses some key northern territory, but they still have the St. Lawrence River. They still have this vast interior. The rivalry is still simmering.
Exactly. It wasn't resolved, just sort of paused. And that tension just explodes again with King George's War, which kicks off in 1744.
Now, what's so fascinating here is the colonists actually pull off a huge victory in this one, right?
They do. An incredible one. In 1745, colonial forces, mostly from New England, captured the French fortress of Louisbourg.
And Louisbourg it was a huge deal.
It was the key. It guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, which was the absolute lifeline for all of New France. Capturing it was a massive, massive win.
But the real kicker, the thing that sets up everything to come, is what happens at the peace treaty. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle.
Precisely. This is where all the frustration that fuels the final war comes from.
So what happened?
Despite all the effort, the blood and treasure spent capturing Louisbourg, the British just gave it back.
Wait, they gave it back?
They traded it back to the French in exchange for some territory in India and Europe.
Oh, the colonists must have been absolutely furious.
Furious is an understatement. For them, this was proof that Britain saw them as a pawn, that London's priorities were in Europe, not in protecting the colonies. And that lack of resolution, that feeling of being sold out, is what makes the next war inevitable.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because this next conflict isn't just another round. This is the round, the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763.
This was the war that decided the fate of the continent. And what's different is that it didn't start in Europe and spread here.
Right.
This one started right here in North America, over land claims in the Ohio Valley.
And the spark that lit this global fire was a very young, Very ambitious George Washington.
It was. I mean, you have British land companies pushing into the Ohio Valley, which France saw as essential to connect Canada with Louisiana. In 1754, Washington, just a 22-year-old lieutenant colonel, is sent out there.
And it doesn't go well.
Not at all. It leads to a deadly clash, and then the disastrous Battle of Fort Necessity, where he's forced to surrender to the French.
So a surrender by a British officer in the middle of nowhere somehow escalates into a world war.
It does, because France saw it as aggression, Britain saw it as a total humiliation. And, in those early years, the French were actually doing very well.
The timeline shows some major British defeats at the start.
It was really tough for them. In 1755, there's the Battle of the Monongahela, a disaster where General Braddock is just routed. Then from 56 to 57, the French capture these critical forts, Fort Oswego, and most famously, Fort William Henry.
Why were those forts so important? What did losing them mean?
They controlled everything. Oswego controlled Lake Ontario, cutting British communication to the west. Fort William Henry was the linchpin for any invasion route down into New York. For a couple of years there, it really looked like the French had the upper hand.
But then?
Yeah.
Something changes. London starts pouring in massive resources, money, troops. The tide turns. When does that shift really happen?
The momentum starts to build in 1758. The British start winning. And you remember that fortress they handed back? Louisburg.
Yeah.
They recaptured it in 1758, choking off that St. Lawrence lifeline again. And then, crucially, they captured Fort Duquesne.
That's the spot where Washington had surrendered, right near there.
The very same place. They renamed it Fort Pitt, and taking it wasn't just symbolic revenge.
What was the strategic value?
Fort Duquesne controlled the Ohio River, the gateway to the entire Ohio Valley. Taking it basically shattered the French defensive perimeter and drove a wedge between Canada and their western territories.
Okay, so the supply lines are cut, the gateway is secured.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the pivotal year, the year that really spells the end for French North America, 1759.
Absolutely. 1759. The British called it the Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles. It was just one knockout blow after another. They took Fort Niagara, sealing off the Great Lakes, and then the big one, the Battle of Quebec.
The legendary battle on the Plains of Abraham. That wasn't just a military loss for France, it was. It had to be psychologically devastating.
It was a total victory for the British, even though both Generals Montcalm and Wolfe died in the fighting, and that momentum just carried through. By 1760, when Montreal fell, that was effectively the end of French power in Canada.
So the fighting is basically over by 1760. Now we get to the reckoning. What did all of this mean for the map?
The consequences were staggering, and they were made official in the Treaty of Paris in 1763.
And the scale of what France lost is just mind-boggling.
It was a near total wipeout. France ceded basically all of its territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain, Canada, all of it.
Gone.
Just gone. An entire continental empire they'd fought for over a century vanished.
But it wasn't just Britain getting land, right? Spain was involved too.
That's right. As part of these complex negotiations, France also gave Louisiana its territory west of the Mississippi to Spain, mostly to compensate Spain for losing Florida to the British.
So in one treaty, France is basically removed as a major power from the continent.
Exactly. And let's pause here because this is the critical turn. Britain has just won this enormous empire, but the victory came at a massive, massive cost. The 7 Years' War plunged them into incredible debt.
And now they have to govern and defend this huge new territory.
Which is expensive. And it leads directly to Britain's most disastrous political decision.
The taxes.
The taxes. To pay off the war debt and manage the new lands, Britain starts levying new taxes on the American colonies. And on top of that, they issue the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids colonists from settling west of the Appalachians.
The very land they felt they had just fought and died for.
You can see why they were enraged. The victory of 1763 directly created the exact conditions, financial and political, that made the American Revolution inevitable.
It sounds like the story should end there for France. A century of war ending in total defeat. But there's this incredible twist. France gets one last, very important act.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? The defeat in 1763 perfectly sets the stage for France's final role on the continent. Helping their old enemies' colonies break away, it was the perfect revenge.
So less than 2 decades after being defeated, France is throwing its full military weight, its navy, its army behind the Americans in the Revolutionary War.
Yes, starting with their formal alliance in 1778. But their most critical contribution comes in 1781 at the Siege of Yorktown.
Which is basically the battle that wins the war for the Americans.
And it couldn't have happened without the French. The French fleet blockaded the coast, cutting off any chance of British retreat or reinforcement by sea.
And their troops were on the ground.
Right there alongside Washington's army. They were instrumental in securing that final victory, which in turn secured American independence.
So we've gone from these small frontier skirmishes in 1689 to France losing an entire empire in 1763, and then finally helping create a new nation by 1783. The sources make it so clear that France's actions, even in defeat, fundamentally shaped the continent.
And that really leaves us with a final thought for you to consider.
Yeah.
France was, without a doubt, the biggest loser in 1763. They ceded this vast territory. But just 20 years later, they used their remaining power to make sure their rival, Britain, loses its own prize colonies.
It's a perfect example of how a huge military victory can have these hidden long-term costs that come back to bite you.
It really is. I mean, consider the incredible irony. France's own defeat made Britain so indebted and overextended that it sparked the revolution. A revolution that France then got to fund and fight in, getting its revenge and changing the balance of power in the Atlantic world forever.
A truly fascinating and very costly cycle of events. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a century of conflict that truly defined a continent. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a piece of North American history that honestly gets glossed over way too often.
It really does.
You get this standard picture of the 17th and 18th centuries. It's the French versus the British. It's colonizers versus the wilderness.
Right. And that picture is it's not just incomplete, it's fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, it misses the most important players on the board.
Exactly. It's an issue of agency. We're going to dig into the sources that show the indispensable and highly strategic role of Native American nations.
These weren't just side alliances, were they?
No, not at all. They were the central pillar of the entire French presence in North America. The whole thing was built on these relationships.
So our mission today is to get past that simple summary. We want to really understand the nuance.
Mm-hmm.
Who were these allies? Why did they choose the French? And maybe most importantly, what was the ultimate cost when that whole world got turned upside down?
And for you listening, to really get this, you have to understand that these wars, the French and Indian War being the big one, they weren't just European conflicts happening on American soil.
Wow.
They were deeply, deeply rooted in existing tribal geopolitics, long-standing rivalries and alliances that were already there.
Okay, so the sources are pretty clear that the French were, almost totally dependent on these partnerships.
Totally. It was all driven by mutual benefit. These alliances gave the French critical military advantages and, of course, trade advantages. It's how they held on to this vast territory.
A territory they could never have controlled otherwise.
Never. The relationship was symbiotic. For the French, you get the fur trade, you get a local defense force. For the native nations, you get an ally, you get firearms, metal goods.
And a buffer, a crucial counterbalance against the British, who were just constantly pushing west.
That's the key, the relentless land hunger of the British colonies.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right at the foundation. Why the French? What made them such an attractive partner compared to the British?
It really just comes down to one thing: real estate, or their priorities for it.
Okay.
The main goal for New France was commerce, specifically the beaver fur trade that was, fueling the fashion industry in Europe.
Right.
To do that, you don't need to clear cut the forest. You need access to it. You need safe passage on the rivers. And that requires cooperation, not conquest.
So it's a completely different model. The British are all about massive agricultural settlements, which means they need the land itself.
Precisely. And that distinction would have been crystal clear to any tribal leader at the time. One group wants to trade with you,
and the other wants to take your land and replace you.
Exactly. The French population was always pretty small, mostly in Quebec, Montreal, and then scattered around these little trading posts.
Forts. But they weren't really military forts in the way we think of them.
No, not always. A lot of them were more like fortified warehouses and diplomatic hubs. They weren't clearing huge tracts of land for farms, so the threat they posed just felt lesser, more negotiable.
And that commercial need, it basically defined their territory. We talk about the Great Lakes, but the sources really zero in on this area called the Territorial.
The upper country, yeah, that was the engine room of the whole fur trade.
Yeah.
It stretches from the Great Lakes deep into the continent.
And that's where the key tribes were.
Yes. Groups like the Huron or Wendat and the various Algonquin peoples, they controlled the flow of the best furs. So the French model was simple. Supply them with goods iron tools, blankets, guns, in exchange for access.
And that builds these really durable alliances. It's based on economic necessity, and it creates a kind of protective barrier for the French Empire.
It does, but I'm wondering, was it all just about beaver pelts, or was there a military dimension to it from the start? I mean, were the French backing them in their own conflicts?
Oh, absolutely. That's where it gets much more complex. They weren't just traders.
They were allies in what was basically a regional arms race.
An arms race, yeah.
For a lot of these tribes, an alliance with the French gave them a critical edge against their own long-standing enemies.
And the big one there was the Iroquois Confederacy.
The Iroquois, yeah. Who were often, though not always, allied with the British. So the French are supplying military gear to their allies, which helps them fight the Iroquois, which in turn cements their loyalty to the French.
So it's not just a simple transaction. It is calculated geopolitical maneuvering.
On both sides. Everyone knew what they were doing.
Which brings us right to the French and Indian War. I mean, this is where you really see how indispensable those alliances were.
From 1754 to 63, the French were vastly outnumbered by the British colonists, but they held their own for years.
And they could only do that because of their native allies.
Entirely. The military strength they provided was essential. I mean, you can't overstate the importance of guerrilla warfare.
Ambushes, raids, using the forest.
All of it. The French army learned and adopted these tactics because they had to. Because they worked.
And that local knowledge.
Yeah.
That knowledge of the terrain. That might have been the single biggest advantage they had.
It was a massive asymmetrical advantage. You can ship over thousands of British regulars in their bright red coats, but if they're marching in formation through a dense forest...
They're just targets.
They're just targets. You see it perfectly in 1755 at the Battle of the Monongahela. Braddock's defeat.
Right, General Braddock. He just marches his army in classic European style right towards Fort Duquesne.
And the French and their allies, a much smaller force, just melt into the trees and ambush them. The British force was, it was annihilated.
That one battle says it all, really. It wasn't about numbers, it was about tactics, and those tactics were only possible because of their allies. That must have sent a shockwave through the British command.
A total game changer. And again, you have to remember the tribe's own motivations. For the Shawnee and the Delaware in the Ohio Valley, the French were their last, best hope against settlers pouring over the mountains from Pennsylvania and Virginia.
So for them, fighting with France was literally about preserving their homeland.
It was a fight for survival.
Now, you mentioned the Iroquois before, and we have to stress this complexity. It wasn't like all Native Americans were on one side.
Not at all. That's a fundamental misunderstanding. While the Huron and Algonquins were mostly pro-French, the Iroquois, they were masters of diplomacy.
They're like both sides.
They played a very complex game, sometimes neutrality, sometimes actively allying with the British to put pressure on their own rivals who were allied with the French.
So the French and Indian War isn't just a European war. It's a continuation of intertribal conflicts, but now with European guns and money poured into the mix.
Exactly. It's a series of proxy wars layered on top of older rivalries. It created this incredibly fluid, chaotic situation that the Europeans struggled to control.
So beyond the battlefield, let's talk about the non-military side of this. The French approach to alliance building was different there too.
It was, and a huge part of that was the role of the missionaries, specifically the Jesuits.
The Jesuits. Now, their role went way beyond just trying to convert people, didn't it?
Oh, far beyond. They were diplomats, they were ethnographers, they were interpreters. Their whole philosophy was immersion. They would go deep into the interior and live in these communities for years.
What made them so effective, more so than just a trader or a soldier?
I think the sources really point to their commitment to language. They learned the local languages, documented them. That gave them this incredible insight into the culture, the politics, the proper way to do things.
So they become these cultural bridges. They're not just translating words, they're translating intent. They're translating entire worldviews.
Exactly. And that builds a level of trust that you just can't get from a purely commercial or military relationship. They would negotiate trade deals, mediate disputes, coordinate military plans.
They were the diplomatic glue holding the whole thing together.
In many ways, yes. They did the patient, long-term work that solidified those alliances for over a century.
Okay, so this is where the story turns. It's where it gets really interesting, but also tragic.
Deeply tragic.
What happens when your indispensable ally just loses? When France is suddenly gone from North America?
It's a catastrophe, a pivotal disaster for every single tribe that had allied with them.
Despite everything they contributed, the military victories, the trade, all of it.
None of it mattered to the British. The victory in 1763 just flips the whole chessboard. That protective buffer the French provided against British expansion
Is just gone overnight.
Gone. They went from being essential sovereign partners in a global enterprise to being obstacles in the path of an unrestrained British Empire that now wanted their land.
And the change was immediate. The British took over the French forts, but they didn't continue the French policies, did they?
Not even close. They arrived with a conqueror's mindset. The whole French system of diplomacy, of gift-giving, of mutual respect. The British commander, Geoffrey Amherst, he viewed it with contempt.
So he cuts it all off.
He cuts off the flow of gifts, ammunition, the things that were the lifeblood of these alliances. And that betrayal, combined with the new immediate threat of settlement, it just explodes.
And that explosion is Pontiac's War.
Pontiac's War, right in 1763. It was this massive coordinated resistance. The Ottawa leader, Pontiac, unites multiple tribes in this desperate attempt to literally drive the British out of the upper country.
So the direct result of the French loss isn't peace. It's a massive new war.
A war of survival. They're fighting against a power that no longer needs them and in fact sees them as being in the way.
It's such a painful irony. They fought so hard alongside the French to keep their lands and their sovereignty.
And when that failed, the result was even faster colonial expansion, more displacement, and the beginning of the end for many of their societies as they had existed. They shaped the entire conflict, but they paid the ultimate price.
So if we're going to summarize this whole deep dive, we've seen that the French presence in North America was built on a network of alliances.
Alliances rooted in the fur trade, in mutual benefit, not in mass settlement.
And those alliances were militarily decisive. They gave the French an edge in conflicts like the French and Indian War, and they were held together by these sophisticated cultural go-betweens like the Jesuits.
Right.
But the real takeaway, the thing we really want you to remember, is what happened after 1763. The British victory didn't bring peace. For the tribes, it brought vulnerability, war, and displacement on a scale they hadn't seen before.
And I think the most important thing to realize here is that these Native American nations were never just supporting actors. They weren't sidekicks. They were indispensable sovereign participants making their own strategic decisions. Their choices shaped the entire geopolitical landscape of the continent for a century and a half.
Yeah.
The French project could not have existed without them.
But their societies bore the cost when it all came crashing down.
The highest cost.
So we'll leave you with a final thought to chew on. Imagine for a moment that the French had won, that their model, based on trade, alliances, and minimal settlement, had persisted. How would the history of the United States, that relentless push west, have been fundamentally different? What would a North America built on that kind of permanent alliance-based model have even looked like?
Yeah. Consider the difference between a continent defined by fences and one defined by canoes.
Dive deep.